So you just met this gloriously dashing officer, and he's just so well-mannered and charming. And what if he's secretly like Mr. Wickham? How can you know that you're not being deceived by one of the many Wickhams, Willoughbys, half the Tilneys, the Thorpes, Mr. Elliot, the Crawfords of Jane Austen's world? Well, in today's video, we're going to be going into the 3 things you need to do to make sure that you're not being deceived by a scoundrel. And we're also going to be talking about reality and how characters construct reality in Jane Austen's books. If you want to learn more about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. So first up, let's talk about Jane Austen and reality. Jane Austen's characters all live in their own little realities that they've constructed, just like really we all do. Obviously, my reality, that cats are awesome, is different from someone else's reality, that cats are horrible. Of course, their reality is wrong. But basically, we all live in our own realities that are shaped by our worldview, our experiences in life, information we understand or trust, etc. Now, a lot of Jane Austen's stories are specifically hinged on this question of what if reality goes wrong? What if the way we understand reality is so different from what reality actually is? And Jane Austen really draws that difference there between reality and appearances of reality. So for example, in Pride and Prejudice, reality appears that Mr. Wickham is great and wonderful, when actually he's a scoundrel. What causes the gap between these two? Why are appearances so different from reality? What creates this problem? And then how do we close the gap so that our understanding of reality is more accurate? Dealing with these issues of appearance versus reality is a main theme that runs through all of Jane Austen's books. And it's so deeply embedded in her writing that it also affects how she constructs sentences. She uses words like seem and appear quite a bit, which creates this feeling that what something appears to be may or may not be accurate. So for example, when Elizabeth goes to visit Mr. Collins and Charlotte in their newlywed state, Mr. Collins tells her that he and Charlotte seem to be made for each other. And of course, here we have Jane Austen playing on the fact that we know that secretly Charlotte is trying to avoid Collins at all cost. But to Collins, it seems like they're made for each other because Charlotte is doing a great job at deceiving him of her true feelings. And really, trying to create false appearances or false impressions is something that all of her characters do, even the good characters. So for example, in Northanger Abbey, when Mrs. Allen is telling Henry Tilney all about muslins, it says, Mr. Tilney was polite enough to seem interested in what she said. So here again, another usage of the word seem. Mr. Tilney is seeming interested out of politeness. Whether he's actually interested or not is left open for debate by the sentence construction. Meanwhile, in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth gets that letter from Darcy, and she's like, wow, my whole life is a lie, and she has an emotional breakdown, kind of, and then she has to go back to the Collins house. Well, she doesn't want them to know that she just had an emotional moment, and it says, she entered the house with the wish of appearing as cheerful as usual. So again, a usage of the word appear. Here, Elizabeth is consciously deciding to appear cheerful. She's trying to give this false reality to the Collinses that she is fine. Of course, Mr. Tilney just wanted to be polite, and Elizabeth just wanted everyone not to know that she had drama going down. But not all characters' motives are as seemingly innocent as that when they create false appearances. For example, Mr. Wickham. In fact, the issues involving understanding Darcy and understanding Wickham has to do heavily with this appearance versus reality gap. As Jane Bennet puts it, one has got all the goodness and the other all the appearance of it. So Mr. Wickham has all the appearance of goodness, while Mr. Darcy actually has goodness, he's just not very good at appearing so. And of course, when someone with all the appearance of goodness like Mr. Wickham enters the equation, where he's dealing with young single females that might lose their reputation because of him, suddenly the stakes become incredibly grave and dangerous. An example of this would be in Sense and Sensibility, where Colonel Brandon's ward Eliza trusts someone with the appearance of goodness, namely Willoughby, and he gets her pregnant and ruins her entire life. And those are the dangerous stakes of when a girl does not understand the reality versus the appearance. So the question then becomes, how do we close the gap? How do we understand someone's true nature and reality versus how they appear? So that we can protect ourselves, not get involved with a scoundrel, and have our whole lives ruined. Well, that takes us to the 3 things we need to do in order to construct an accurate reality that lets us make better life choices. So, what are these important 3 steps? Well, step 1 is that we need to examine ourselves. Step 2 is examine who we trust. And step 3 is give ourselves time. Let's dive into step number 1, examining ourselves. In Jane Austen's books, the main character's ability to see a reality or not is heavily influenced, I would say the most, by themselves. Jane Austen's interest in how somebody's worldview can completely blind them from seeing reality was something she was interested in very early in life. For example, let's talk about her juvenile work, Love and Friendship. Just a quick note about Love and Friendship, it is separate from Lady Susan, which is the Jane Austen work that went on to become the movie Love and Friendship. They thought Love and Friendship was just a better title, so they stole it off one of her other stories and stuck it on Lady Susan. That's just an important side note. Anyway, the actual story of Love and Friendship is of a girl who goes around doing the most ridiculous things because of how she views reality is super skewed. She lives in a skewed reality that's focused way too much on sensibility or that preoccupation with emotions that we've talked about in other videos that was popular in literature at the time. And basically, this skewed reality makes her go around doing things that are hurtful to herself and others, but in her worldview, they are the right things to do. And of course, it's heavily satirical of sensibility literature at the time, but what makes it so funny is our ability to see the fact that this girl is acting contrary to actual reality because she has her own alternate world she lives in. And obviously, while this is Jane Austen's juvenile work and it's highly less sophisticated than her later pieces, its main plotline is more or less the same thing of a girl who can't see reality accurately, and it makes her make all of these serious mistakes. I mean, that is exactly what Elizabeth Bennet does, it's what Emma Woodhouse does, it's what Catherine Morland does. And really, with her other heroines, she delves exactly into what part of their personality and their worldview is creating the problems. How they solve these problems is through self-reflection. They need to understand themselves better and fix these things about their worldview in order to have a more accurate view of reality. So what are some of these things about ourselves that could be blinding us to the truth? Elizabeth has the failing of being very prejudiced. When she has her self-reflective moment, she understands her problem is of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. So she was blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd. Again, these are all deficiencies within herself that was making her create false realities and making her believe false information. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The same thing with Emma. When she has her moment of insight, she understands this. With insufferable vanity has she believed herself in the secret of everybody's feelings. With unpardonable arrogance proposed to arrange everybody's destiny. So Emma understands that it was her own arrogance and her own vanity that led her to create all of these problems in her life. Also, Emma rues what blindness, what madness had led her on. Again, the word blindness. Elizabeth also thought she was blind. They were blinded from reality. And there are a lot of different things that can blind us from reality, such as Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park is blinded by his own attraction, Mary Crawford. Mary Crawford, more or less, doesn't really hide a lot of her faults. She is who she is, but it's Edmund wanting her to be something better that blinds him to her actual qualities. As Fanny notes, he was deceived in her, Mary Crawford. He gave her merits which she had not. Her faults were what they had ever been, but he saw them no longer. His attraction to her was blinding him to her faults and making him think she had great merits that she did not have. Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey is fascinating because she has a whole range of issues going on that create her problems. One of her problems is that she's incredibly naive and sheltered. In her upbringing, she hasn't been exposed to a lot of bad characters, and when she does meet them for the first time, she doesn't know how to accurately interpret their behavior. For example, when dealing with Mr. Thorpe lying, this is how Catherine reacts. Catherine listened with astonishment. She knew not how to reconcile two such very different accounts of the same thing. For she had not been brought up to understand the propensities of a rattle, nor to know to how many idle assertions and impudent falsehoods the excess of vanity will lead. Her own family were plain, matter-of-fact people who seldom aimed at wit of any kind. So as we see here, she does not know how to reconcile lies because she doesn't understand that the person could be lying. We see the same thing later when her brother is engaged to Miss Thorpe, but Isabella goes out and starts flirting with other guys. She doesn't know how to reconcile this behavior. In fact, she defends Isabella's behavior to Henry Tilney by saying, "Oh no, not flirts. A woman in love with one man cannot flirt with another." So because Isabella's behavior does not line up with what Catherine expects it to be, she again can't reconcile it, and she can't understand that there is deception afoot. Which goes back to one of Catherine's bigger issues, which is the tendency to look for what she expects. And really, Catherine's moment of great personal insight is about this tendency. When she realizes that her false impression of Northanger was all a voluntary, self-created delusion, each trifling circumstance receiving importance from an imagination resolved on alarm, and everything forced to bend to one purpose by a mind which, before she entered the abbey, had been craving to be frightened. So here Catherine's realizing that she created this false delusion, as she says, because her mind was craving for it to be reality. And this idea that we construct realities that we want to be true goes back again to Emma. When Emma decides that Mr. Elton is going to fall in love with Harriet, she only looks for information to support this, and she ignores everything to the contrary. Elizabeth Bennet does the same thing. After Mr. Darcy is initially like, "She's not handsome enough to tempt me," she interprets all of his future behavior along those same lines, that he does not like her, even though his behavior shifts, if she had watched them more closely, could have informed her that he maybe had changed his mind a little bit. We see this when she's at Rosings and Mr. Darcy comes over to the piano. She interprets it as him trying to make her feel uncomfortable, when in reality it's because he liked her. But again, she was interpreting everything to support her preconceived notion. Going back to Catherine Northanger Abbey again, she also suffers from the bias that other people would act the same as she would in any given situation. And this is something Henry Tilney actually points out about her. He says, "With you, it is not how is such a one likely to be influenced? What is the inducement most likely to act upon such a person's feelings, age, situation, and probable habits of life considered? But how should I be influenced? What would be my inducement for acting so and so?" So rather than trying to think, well, what this person would do in a situation, Catherine simply asks herself, what would I do in that situation? Which, going back to Elizabeth, she does the same thing. When Charlotte is entertaining attentions from Mr. Collins, Elizabeth can't imagine that Charlotte would accept him because she wouldn't. After Charlotte does accept Collins, though, and after Bingley runs away to London, leaving Jane, Elizabeth is left there bemoaning the inconstancy of human characters. But what she's actually upset about is they're not living up to what she imagines they would be. Here we have Charlotte, whose character has not changed, and she was behaving in line with her character. But rather, she did not live up to what Elizabeth imagines she should be. Likewise, Mr. Bingley was always extremely unsteady, flying off from one place to another, and persuadable and humble. He was acting as he would, but he was not living up to what Elizabeth imagined he would be. First, on step one, what we would need to do to avoid being taken in by the likes of Wickham is analyze ourselves. Look in ourselves for these deficiencies, make sure that we're not just expecting other people to act like us, trying to understand them as individuals, and also correcting pride, vanity, a tendency to be overly trusting, etc. Basically, self-reflection time, guys. Once we've done that, we can go into step number 2, which is decide who to trust. Knowing who to trust in life can be very, very difficult, especially because there are many master manipulators out there trying to create false realities in our heads. A perfect example of this is Jane Austen's story, Lady Susan. What's fascinating about Lady Susan, which is, again, is the basis for the movie Love and Friendship, even though in my opinion they totally slaughtered it in that movie, but that's not the point here. Basically, Lady Susan is a master manipulator who goes around creating alternate realities in other people's heads so that she can have her own way with them. What's unique about Lady Susan among Jane Austen's works is that we see it from the perspective of the manipulator, where in her other works we see it from the perspective of the deceived. Basically, imagine Pride and Prejudice, but written from the perspective of Mr. Wickham. This is another story that Jane Austen wrote when she was quite young, and I think shows her lifelong interest in what is reality versus what is an appearance, and how people can consciously go in and play with that in other people's heads. What's so fascinating about Jane Austen's deceivers is the fact that they identify the weaknesses of their victims and specifically capitalize on those to get their own way. For example, when Wickham and Elizabeth are just starting their relationship and they're talking about Mr. Darcy, Mr. Wickham is very careful to first ascertain how she feels about Mr. Darcy before smearing Darcy's good name. And Elizabeth readily tells him, "I've spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." Right there, Elizabeth is letting him know that she's already prejudiced against Darcy, and Wickham is able to come in and capitalize off of that, both reinforcing her prejudice and making himself appear great. And he also plays to her vanity by giving her all of this attention. Yeah, essentially using her weaknesses against her. Frank Churchill in Emma does the same thing. He acts like he likes Emma, which plays off of her vanity, blinding her to his true reason for being in the neighborhood, which is, of course, to be around his secret fiancé. Catherine Morland is feeling super lonely and out of place there in Bath when she meets Isabella Thorpe, who immediately plays on her loneliness by becoming her bestie and has expressions of undying love and friendship for her. Meanwhile, Mr. Elliot in Persuasion tries to appear to be the perfect, rational, discreet, polished gentleman who professed good opinions, seemed to judge properly as a man of principle. Basically, to be exactly the man calculated to be attractive to a woman like Anne Elliot. Now, while these manipulators are really good at identifying the weaknesses in others and capitalizing off of them, their ways do not work on everyone. Which brings us to the second aspect of the trusting others or not, which is knowing who to trust. Jane Austen's heroines are often torn between trusting two opposing sources of information. So, for example, does Emma trust the fact that Frank Churchill makes fun of Miss Fairfax and thereby has no feelings for her? Or does she trust it when Mr. Knightley's like, "Hey, I actually think they got something going on. There's some secret looks abounding here. Does she trust Frank Churchill or does she trust Mr. Knightley? Frank Churchill is playing off her weaknesses and her vanity. Meanwhile, Mr. Knightley has been her lifelong friend that she knows she can trust. But we see her go with Frank Churchill, which again is going back to Emma's own heart also being deceptive, and how sometimes we have to decide between trusting our own heart versus trusting someone else. So for example, when Emma thinks that Mr. Elton is definitely in love with Harriet, where Mr. Knightley's like, you know what, Mr. Elton's actually not that great of a guy and he wants to marry money. Who does she trust? Her own heart's desire? Or what Mr. Knightley says? Again, in Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte points out to Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy acts like he likes you. And Elizabeth's like, no, because it doesn't line up with her own preconceived notions. Likewise, when it comes down to trusting either Mr. Wickham or trusting what Mr. Bingley has to say about Mr. Wickham through Jane, she goes with Mr. Wickham. Again, it's their weaknesses or the things they struggle with that's making them trust people who objectively aren't the ones they should be trusting. So what do we learn about this? Well, that we need to carefully examine who we are trusting and see if our own weaknesses are being played off by others. Now that we've done that, we need the third factor to make sure we're not marrying a Wickham, and that is time. Giving ourselves time to observe. On the importance of giving ourselves enough time to observe, let's turn to Eleanor Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. Here she says this: I have frequently detected myself in such kind of mistakes, in a total misapprehension of character in some point of other, fancying people so much more gay or grave, or ingenious or stupid than they really are, and I can hardly tell why or in what the deception originated. Sometimes one is guided by what they say of themselves, and very frequently of what other people say of them, without giving oneself time to deliberate and judge. So here we see Eleanor talking about that gap between what we believe to be true versus what is true, and how that can be affected by what other people say, what they say of themselves. But what we really need here is time to observe and judge. We see this need for time over and over again in Austen's works. Very early in Pride and Prejudice, we see characters discussing knowing or not knowing the truth about Mr. Bingley. In chapter 2, Mr. Bennet says, one cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. So fortnight's 2 weeks. 2 weeks is not enough time to know a man's true character. Elizabeth Bennet herself echoes this. Slightly later, when talking about her sister Jane's feelings for Bingley, as yet she cannot even be certain of the degree of her own regard, nor of its reasonableness. She has known him only a fortnight. So again, 2 weeks is not a sufficient amount of time to truly know someone else. We see a similar sentiment with Anne Elliot in Persuasion with regard to her cousin, Mr. Elliot. It says, though they had now been acquainted a month, she could not be satisfied that she really knew his character. So here, Anne recognizes that a month is not long enough to truly know a man's character. Anne Elliot is a fascinating heroine because she is one of the few that actually gives herself time to make these sort of decisions. She doesn't rush blind into liking Mr. Elliot just because he's incredibly flattering to her. In fact, in her observations, she notices that he's slightly too perfect. It says, Mr. Elliot was too generally agreeable. Various as were the tempers in her father's house, he pleased them all. He endured too well, stood too well with everybody. She takes this as a form of insincerity and recognizes that she's not truly seeing who he really is because it's almost like he's acting for everybody. So really we see that it takes time to truly get to know someone and that we need to observe them and compare what they say with what they actually do. And really, time is a revealer of true character in Austen's works, because bad characters will eventually do bad things, and those bad things will come to light. For example, Wickham will eventually have to skip town because of running away from his debts, and possibly run off with a teenage girl. Willoughby's past transgressions will come out. Isabella will break your brother's heart. Mary Crawford will not take seriously the offensives of her brother, and speaking of her brother, he's gonna run off with a married woman. Eventually, bad characters will do bad things. You just have to give them a long enough time for it to happen. A long enough time before what, you may say? Well, before you become best friends with them, fall in love with them, and certainly, like Anne Elliot, you'd want to discover this before you marry them. So, how do you avoid marrying Mr. Wickham? Well, first of all, you would have to do some deep self-reflection, making sure that your worldviews are not blinding you from reality. Second, you would need to make sure you are trusting the right people and that you're not letting people capitalize off of your weaknesses. And third, you need to give yourself enough time for their true character to show, and also time for you to observe their actions and compare them with their words. And if you do all of these things, you can successfully avoid being taken in by appearances and having your future ruined by a scoundrel. Let me know in the comments down below. Do you think you could successfully avoid marrying a scoundrel? Or would you be taken in by a handsome redcoat who's just so dashing, but secretly a rake? Let me know in the comments below. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. And keep having an awesome day, because you are awesome. Bye! Turn it to a lie.